Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris and you're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Now, many of you may have been wondering why I've been hosting the show alone lately. We here at Astro AWANI want to ensure that we practice what we've been reporting to you, and that includes social and physical distancing while we're on air. And on top of that, all our guests and experts will be joining us remotely on the phone or via video call instead of in person in the studio. Hopefully, we too can help break the chain of infection while still bringing you all the information you need to know. Now, speaking of which, here are the latest numbers on COVID-19. So the latest news is that a third Malaysian has died from the virus. The deceased was patient 152, a 58-year-old man who was part of the Tabligh cluster. Now, in terms of numbers, 130 new cases of COVID-19 have been recorded today, and that pushes Malaysia past the 1,000 mark. The total number of confirmed COVID cases in Malaysia is now 1,030. Malaysia now has the fourth highest number of COVID-19 infections in Asia. Much has been said about the impact of COVID-19 and the collapse of financial markets, but what we want to also do tonight is highlight the direct impact to the real economy and to households. Now, a survey by Bank Negara in 2018 had found that more than 75% of Malaysians said it was a challenge to raise 1,000 ringgit in cash in the event of an emergency. So how then do we flatten the curve while ensuring that households have enough resources to ride out the pandemic in the next few months? Joining us via Skype, we have Christopher Chung, Deputy Director of Research at Khazanah Research Institute. Chris, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, the government has recently introduced the kind of one-off payout to workers, that's 600 ringgit to employees who are forced to take unpaid leave. Meanwhile, retrenched workers get coverage from the EIS, the Employment Insurance Scheme. Now, Chris, do you think that these measures are going to be enough to protect Malaysian workers during this time?
I think, let me just start by saying, I think the 600 ringgit payout that is introduced via EIS is actually a very good initiative, in the sense that I think prior to this whole COVID breakout, the EIS actually is focused on retrenchment. That means it's only for workers who are unemployed. But because of COVID-19, they've actually extended the coverage to cover an extra area of risk, which is actually to look at workers who are forced to take unpaid leave. In fact, the 600 ringgit is not a once-off payment, but it's actually for a period of 6 months where they will get a monthly payment of 600 ringgit. So in that sense, I think it is very much in line with our thinking as well on what I call the employment retention strategy, something that I've written about. But I know also SOFTO actually has some constraints when it comes to funding, when it comes to this program. So they actually have to negotiate some of the trade-offs in terms of how much they should be covering, what kind of risks they should be looking at, who are the groups that they should prioritize, and what is the duration of the payment, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And I think given all these constraints, I think the priority for them is to make sure that the workers who are from the lower income group would actually receive the benefit payment first, at least for this first phase.
But Chris, I just want to come back very quickly to that 600 ringgit payout, right? 600 ringgit is still below the minimum wage. Should that be a concern?
Yeah, so I think the limitation because of some of these funding constraints is that one is the benefit amount is on the low side. So as you have rightly pointed out, it is 600 ringgit, which is half of the minimum wage. In fact, if you take the average wage of 2018, it is actually about only 26% of the average wage, which means that if you think about this as a form of replacement income, because people cannot be receiving their wages for the next few months, it is definitely insufficient. But I think another limitation is also actually in terms of coverage. It's only covering workers in formal employment, and it actually doesn't cover a lot of the workers who are in the what we call the informal, the non-standard forms of work, your contract workers. or your self-employed workers. And these are actually workers who could be actually at this point providing a lot of services while we are on control movement period.
Right. So how would you go about saying what can the government do to ensure that those workers, the informal workers, the workers that are not covered by these measures, what should we do to make sure that no worker is left behind?
Yeah, so I think one of the proposals that I'm putting forward is actually we should extend this to the self-employed workers. So SOCSO actually has something called the self-employment social security scheme, where they have actually some categories of self-employed workers who are registered with the scheme. But only thing is that this scheme is meant to provide insurance for employment injuries, and it's not meant for issues of unemployment or labor reduction measures. So suggesting that you can actually take this database, because it means that actually SOCSO has a registry of affected workers who are self-employed registered with them, and we can use this as an opportunity to encourage more self-employed workers to register with this scheme. But then in terms of the payout mechanism, they can actually utilize the EIS as a way, like how they extended the coverage to people who are on forced unpaid leave. They can easily extend this to self-employed workers. Right. And in fact, we are thinking that it should also be extended to other forms of labor reduction. That means it's not just about workers who are now forced to take unpaid leave, but also workers who may be experiencing wage cuts, for example, or even reduction in terms of working hours, which will eventually result in wage cuts. So these are the different areas of coverage which is currently not in the scheme. But as I said, I think there are some funding constraints. So I think there are all these things that we need to prioritize. But I think in the longer term, I think we should think about some of these issues a bit more. Yeah,
definitely the funding constraints will come into play. But I want to touch very quickly on the topic that you mentioned a bit earlier and that you've written about, the employment retention strategy. So you've actually called for the government to rethink their economic stimulus approach and instead consider an employment retention strategy. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
So when I talk about employment retention strategy, I think the larger thinking is really that we cannot think about economic stimulus in the conventional way. Like this is not a normal economic crisis where you can put in place a stimulus to encourage people to spend or to increase aggregate demand. I mean, this is the normal way of how we think about a stimulus. And the problem is because the nature of this crisis is actually caused by a global pandemic. So there is a direct contradiction here with trying to contain a pandemic, to ask people to stay at home, and wanting people to go out there and spend and to consume. So I think we have to recognize this trade-off right now. And I think for me, the priority has to be the public health to contain the virus. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that our workers and our businesses currently are not productive. They're staying at home, not because they're inherently unproductive, but it is because they are trying to avert a crisis. I mean, they're trying not to get infected or to be spreading the virus. Right. So I think the strategy is not about stimulating the economy at this time, but it's about preserving what I call the productive potential. That means these workers and these assets that we have, these economic linkages that we have in society, the relationship between firms and workers and whatnot, we cannot allow a short-term shock like this to allow our economy and our society to descend into some form of systemic or more longer-term kind of collapse. Okay. And I think that should be the overall strategy. So when we talk about employment retention strategy, it is really about protecting our workers to make sure that ideally that they still have a job. And if they're affected by some of these labor reduction measures, that they will be getting some kind of support or cash from the government.
That they can make it through these next few months. Now, talking about that productive potential, Chris, in helping preserve that productive potential, the government will need to spend money. So that's back to the funding. How can the government look to fund some of these measures?
Yeah, so I think the funding question is really a big topic that we need to talk about, and it really depends on our outlook on the severity and the duration of this COVID-19. And how long more that we need to impose something like a movement control order. But I think in the long term, I think there would definitely be some challenges on the fiscal space side. I think I've highlighted this in my write-up today. But I think in the short term, I think we definitely have enough resources, because if you remember the first round stimulus that was announced by the government was 20 billion.
Right.
But actually of the 20 billion, 3.5 billion was actually only from the federal government expenditure. So another 3.5 billion was actually from Bank Negara as a form of soft loan. And actually the bulk of the 13 billion was from the reduction in the EPF minimum contribution rate. So I think specifically of this 3.5 billion from the federal government, if you look at the employment retention program, the EIS 600 ringgit payout, it is actually only about 120 million that is allocated for this program.
Right.
So based on a very crude estimation, if we want to extend the coverage to self-employed workers, to cover other forms of labor reduction, or to increase the payout to minimum wage, I think we are looking at tripling the amount from 120 million maybe to an additional 360 million that needs to be injected by the federal government into EIS. So I think 360 million in the larger scheme of things is not a huge amount, because our total budget for 2020 is about 297 billion.
Okay.
So because this has to be considered against larger priorities. So for example, we need to also support frontline workers, our healthcare workers. We need to provide social assistance to the poor and the vulnerable. So employment retention strategy is one of them. But I think it's also one of the priorities that we need to think about. And I think at least in the short term, we can provide adequate protection for our workers, at least for 3 to 6 months.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing those insights in how we can help and protect our workers. Thank you for speaking with us this evening. Now we're going to take a quick break, and after this we're going to take a look at how Malaysians are helping each other in these difficult times. Stay tuned to consider this. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. Hashtag Kita Jaga Kita has been trending on social media for some days now. It's an effort initiated by a group of Good Samaritans, which they say aims to link kind-hearted people with organizations to assist groups that are badly affected by the restriction of movement order. Now, that initiative has evolved into a website, kitajaga.us, with a verified listing of organizations and community groups working to assist those without social protection at this time. Joining us on the line now is Hannah Alkaf. She's the award-winning author of The Weight of Our Sky and a hashtag Kita Jaga Kita team member. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can you tell us a little bit about how this initiative started and what motivated the team to step up and take action?
Hi, Melissa. Thanks for having me on your show. How it actually started was through a Twitter thread. On the 17th of March, in these uncertain times, I was tired of going online and always feeling frustrated or angry or just surrounded by negativity. I was starting to get really, really tired of feeling this way every time I went online and started reading updates or scrolling through my Twitter feed. And I wanted to do something. I wanted to channel all this energy that I had into actually taking action. And so I started looking around for initiatives that were happening on the ground to help people most badly affected by this movement restriction order. And I started compiling it into a thread on Twitter because I thought if I was feeling this way, then there must be other people feeling this way too. And maybe we could all just start doing something for the collective good. So I started compiling this thread, and I started looking around for more and more things, and people would send me things, and I would add it to the thread, and it just sort of grew into this bigger thing.
Okay, well, then tell us a little bit about what hashtag Kita Jaga Kita represents. Some people have used this to reflect a trust deficit of the current measures undertaken by the government. But what does it mean for the team behind it?
For us, it really just means that we take care of our own. It really just means that we need to protect the most vulnerable members of our community, and we need to come together and make sure we all come through to the other side of this unscathed. Right. And if we would just come together and do that, then we have so much power to do good, really. And if we took all the energy that we put into subtweeting or, angry posts on Facebook and things like that and turned it into something good and something positive, then we could do so much more together and protect all of us, not just some of us.
Okay, tell us more about the groups that have been most affected by this restriction of movement order. Hannah, I mean, who are they? Where are they? What do they need? Why have they been forgotten?
You don't have to look very far to see these groups because they're the groups that are always forgotten or who are always less defined or who are always vulnerable. It's just that in a time like this, their vulnerabilities are even more exposed than any other time. So we're talking about your elderly, your disabled, your urban poor, your homeless, your refugees. But in a time like this, where there's a pandemic going on, you're also talking about frontline workers, and you're also talking about all the workers supporting frontline workers or supporting essential services. And all of these groups need our help.
Well,
all of them.
What do they need, Hannah? What do they need the most?
With a lot of groups, there's going to be a need for protective gear for things like masks and sanitizers and just basic necessities in that sense. But for a lot of groups, it's really something as simple as they need food.
Okay.
For a lot of groups, it's really just that basic. And so there are a lot of groups working on the ground to make sure that these groups have what they need. And I just think that if we looked a little beyond ourselves and our own our own discomfort during this time and started thinking about the groups that need so much more, and we could really help them get through this time.
All right. Well, talk to us a little bit about the NGOs that you've kind of recruited to join the Kita Jaga Kita initiative.
Well, first of all, we're not really recruiting anybody. Really, Kita Jaga Kita exists as just as a repository to make sure that there's one place where you can find all these places that need our help, and that somebody verifies those listings so that we can make sure that that any money or assistance that you're offering is going to somewhere legitimate. Because, and it's not fun to think about, but in any situation like this, there's always going to be people who might take advantage of others' generosity. So we think it's important to do a little bit of vetting beforehand. But organizations that we list include things as big as Mercy or Fashion Valley's fundraising efforts with Imaret. There's also community efforts like the Pit Stop Community Cafe and the Lost Food Project. And because we're independent, we have no political affiliation, we list as well any MPs who have set up delivery and assistance in their own constituencies. Basically anything where people can get help, any channel where people can get help, where you can offer assistance or get assistance, we will list it if we can verify it.
Hannah, thank you so much for coming on tonight and telling us about this initiative. Thank you for doing this, and keep up the good work with the team as well. We're going to take a quick break on Consider This. After this, we're going to be speaking to a psychologist about how to use behavioral science to fight COVID-19. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris here with you this evening. Now, many experts have argued that behavioral science must be at the heart of the public health response. Now, we saw many people panic and suffer anxiety following the announcement of the restriction of movement order, and we still see people flouting the order despite the multiple warnings. Now, what can psychology tell us about these responses, and how can we use behavioral science in fighting the spread of the virus? Joining us on the line now, we have Dr. Brendan Gomez, consulting psychologist. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can you go behind some of the fears that have been triggered by the order? I mean, I'm thinking about fears that have triggered the panic buying and the anxiety and such.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Melissa, for having me today, especially as we celebrate United Nations International Day of Happiness. Now, ironic as it may sound, one key reason for this International Day of Happiness, celebrated today on 20th of March, is the suffering of humanity and our planet. And I know most of us, you and me, all of us, are mentally and physically preoccupied with COVID-19. Because one of the things it has done is it has exposed our vulnerability as a human species. You know, we were not prepared for this large-scale global disaster. I think for most of us, if ever we thought of such a scale of an attack, we would have expected it to come from terrorists, from nuclear war, or aliens from another planet, not from a tiny virus.
Right. So we're all kind of grappling with this unprecedented situation. Now, if you could advise the government, what would you advise them to perhaps anticipate or to take into consideration when rolling out new measures, when making new announcements, especially in the coming weeks?
Yeah. You know, I'm so glad you're focusing on addressing the behavioral aspect of this disaster and what governments can do better, because an effective public health strategy needs to take into consideration not just the medical aspect of the situation, but also the psychological aspects. Now, we know military enforcement should be the last resort, right? As both a biologist and a psychologist, I know that we cannot fight viruses with military power. First of all, where are we going to put all the people who are caught? Are we going to put them in prisons? Because this is exactly what we're trying to prevent, crowded situations. So an effective plan, when executed early enough, would mean educating the public and changing behaviors. Now, given such a readiness was not present or possible, we need to take the next best approach. We need an effective knowledge-sharing solution where there is buy-in from people, and that's highly possible as long as it's attractive enough. Now, we've seen thousands turn up for religious gatherings, right? So there is a pull factor. We've seen thousands have stormed supermarkets. So there is a pull factor. Thus, we need to look at what motivates and drives public behavior. Now, currently, we see fear is a motivating factor for all of us, for you, for me, for all of us. The fear of not having enough food, not having enough necessities, not being close enough to family or isolation. The fear of not having a job to come back to, a business that will survive, finances to pay the bills. Now, these are real. These are real fears. No matter whether you're Chinese, no matter whether you're Malay, Indian, white, black, Orang Asli, these are real fears. So if we want masses of people to comply, we need to understand what drives them. It's easy to say that, oh, these people, they're stubborn. Oh, yeah, some may be. It's easy to say, oh, yeah, these people are so selfish. Yeah, some may be. But knowing Malaysians, we have seen our people come together, driven by common concerns, right? For example, in the last elections.
Right.
Now, we need to know, how do we harness this behavioral drive to get people to cooperate with national efforts to curb the spread of COVID-19?
And could you elaborate a bit on, very quickly in the last couple of minutes that we have left, I mean, specifically, how would you harness that fear? Yeah,
so it's a three-step approach. First of all, governments need to work collaboratively with behavioral and public health experts, as they do with medical and security professionals. The biggest change takes place when behavioral learning takes place. Now, some form of this is already happening, but it's not enough. We need to understand what will make these announcements attractive enough, relevant enough for people to pay attention to them and to follow them. Second, we need to get the rakyat, our citizens, on our side, and to deputize them even as collaborators. One way is to reactivate the community and neighborhood groups to lead the way in spreading the message of compliance to movement restrictions. Another way is to provide assurance of basic necessities and food, not just verbally, not just telling us that there's enough food, but in action. Having people in each neighborhood be representatives in checking on daily supplies at the supermarket, providing this info back to the neighborhoods, even in more restricted movements, being the elected people to buy supplies for them. Remember, the most important is that people need to feel a sense of control. In times of threat, our natural human response is to run away or to fight. That's the natural response, fight or flight. We do not want our social fabric to disintegrate either way. A fight response and we see massive panic and movement of people. A fight response and we see social disorder and chaos.
Well,
A third
Yes, I'm going to let you finish with the third one, but we are running out of time. What is the third one?
A third way is to empower individuals and families with what they can do at home to stay sane and well, especially emotionally. And now this is important to us, especially in terms of mental health professionals, because the worst decisions are made when people are not feeling their best or thinking straight. So helping people cope emotionally with their feelings, giving them control, helping them share their ideas and experiences with others will benefit in keeping social order. Now, already 30% of Malaysians have mental health problems, yeah? And if we zoom in on kids, it's almost 1 in 5 that are challenged with issues such as depression or anxiety. We don't want to worsen the statistics. So
Understood.
In this regard, in empowering people, we have launched our strategy of spreading happiness online.
Well,
and this
thank
is
you.
launched today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brandon, for sharing those insights. Happy International Day of Happiness to you. And I'm Melisa Idris signing off for this episode of Consider This. Thank you so much for watching. Stay home and stay safe, everyone. Good night.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear fellow Malaysians, please abide by the movement control order imposed by my government. Don't leave home if there are no pressing matters. Don't balik kampung unless if it's an emergency. This movement control order is imposed to ensure the safety and the well-being of every Malaysian, as we are now facing a serious threat from the outbreak of COVID-19 virus infection. It is a deadly virus. Do not gather or attend any social activities outside your home. My government has guaranteed sufficient stocks and supplies of all essential items throughout these 2-week restrictions, so there is no need for panic buying. I call upon every Malaysian to be responsible and not spread fake news and cause unnecessary panic among us. Please observe your personal hygiene, wash your hands frequently, use hand sanitizer and face masks, stay safe and practice social distancing, and drink lots of water. We will get through this together as Malaysian, as one country. This is the time for us to be strong and persevere. It is better for all of us to be safe than sorry. Inshallah, we shall prevail.